I'm Mara Bennett, 35 years old, and tonight I'm standing in a glass-walled boardroom looking down at the city I helped wire with the very code that keeps our company alive. While across the table, my father introduces my younger sister as the new Chief Operating Officer, smiling like the decision is a blessing and not a blade, and I can feel the room measuring me, the quiet one, the one who built the engine but never touched the wheel. He says I'm a technical marvel the way someone might describe a dishwasher that never breaks. Brooke beams, polished and bright, talking about vision and velocity, while I'm doing math in my head no one asked for. The applause scratches like wool against damp skin. I slide my hands into my pockets so they won't shake, and remind myself of all the nights I slept on the office couch so our platform wouldn't crash at 2 a.m. The elevator doors open, another executive steps in with champagne, and I know without anyone saying it that a line has been drawn. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who should have already known it, tap that, like and subscribe, so more stories like this find the folks who need to hear them. I grew up in a small ranch house on a quiet street where the mail arrived at noon and weekends smelled like cut grass and laundry soap. My parents taught my sister and me to say thank you, to show up early, and to leave places better than we found them. My father believed in building things that last, even if you had to do it with your own two hands, and I took that lesson literally. While other kids traded stickers, I traded lines of code with a neighbor who let me borrow his dusty laptop, learning to solve problems one bug at a time. Money was careful, not careless. Mom clipped coupons and stretched leftovers. Birthdays meant sheet cake and a paper banner saved from the year before. When Dad's idea for an AI-driven logistics platform started to grow from a sketch on a napkin into a real company, I followed him from our garage into a tiny office with mismatched chairs and a leased server we could barely afford, not because anyone promised me anything, but because I believed that good work should hold a person up the way a well-built staircase does, quietly without wobble. The world changed faster than we did. Investors shook hands in conference rooms with ceilings so high they swallowed our voices, and I sat at the end of those tables in jeans and a clean sweater while the suits traded acronyms like currency. I wasn't offended, just aware of the gap between where I came from and where I was standing. I learned to translate people talk on one-channel systems on another, and I kept the platform stable as the numbers climbed from a few thousand transactions a day to millions. Somewhere along the way, the story about me hardened into a tidy phrase my father liked to repeat, because it always got a laugh. Mara is the genius in the back room. She doesn't worry about the business stuff. It wasn't cruel. Just small things accumulate like dust in the corners until one morning you notice the light can't quite make it in. Brooke left for business school on the East Coast and sent home photos of classrooms with polished wood and professors whose names carried weight. I sent patches at 3 in the morning and a list of what we'd need to scale without breaking. When she came back for holidays, she'd tilt her head at our roadmaps and talk about go-to-market speed, and Dad would grin proud because he heard a language that sounded like success. I don't begrudge education. I respect preparation more than promise. But the house got louder when she was home, and I got quieter. The team trusted me, Ben, with his dry humor, Paige with her ruthless precision. But trust doesn't change the way a headline reads, and the world notices titles before it sees fingerprints. The email naming Brooke as COO arrived on a Monday at 7:06 a.m., crisp and cheerful, applauding a new era of strategic leadership. I reread it twice to make sure I hadn't missed the part where the board asked for input, or the part where responsibilities were clearly laid out. My father stopped by my office later that morning with coffee I didn't ask for, and said it would be good for me to focus, as if focus had been my problem. He meant well, he almost always does. But when the announcement went live on our website, a client forwarded it to me with a line that landed heavier than the cup in my hand. Can't wait to see what she promises next. I closed my door and stared at the paneled wall until the knots in the wood found the shape of a map, and for the first time in years, I wondered if the stairs I'd been building led anywhere that had a door with my name on it. At home that night, my mother stirred soup and asked if I'd eaten, while the evening news clattered in the other room. She has always measured love in bowls and blankets, and I have always let her. She said Brooke called excited and nervous, and could I be patient while everyone found their new rhythm? I washed the dishes and listened to the drip from the faucet and decided patience is not the same as silence, and silence is not the same as peace. The next morning, Brooke led her first executive meeting with a slide deck full of bright arrows and short deadlines. She spoke in clean, confident sentences about landing a marquee client that would elevate our profile in the market, and while the room nodded, I watched the calendar in my head slide out of alignment. Paige caught my eye and tapped her pen once against her notebook. Ben didn't look up at all. I've learned not to argue with momentum in the first 5 minutes. It's like trying to stop a truck with your hands. You let it roll, make notes, and wait for the moment when numbers have to become work. After the meeting, my father squeezed my shoulder and told me to support the vision, the way a coach tells the water carrier to run faster, and I nodded because there was nothing useful to say in that hallway. Back at my desk, I reopened the diagram of our core architecture and traced the path a promise would have to take to become real: how many engineers, how much testing, what kind of downtime we could safely absorb, then shut the file without making a single change. The best code I've ever written began with restraint. By the end of that week, a whisper had grown: legs, a potential deal, big and fast, the sort of name you put at the top of a press release and hope sticks. I heard it in the elevator, in the soft clink of dishes, at a too polite family dinner, in the way finance walked a little quicker past my door. I didn't chase the rumor. Rumors prefer to be chased. I went back to my notes, to the logs that don't lie, to the quiet work that holds things together when the spotlight moves somewhere else. And then just before the weekend, Brooke sent a calendar invite for a Monday morning briefing. No agenda, just a title that made the room feel suddenly smaller. I clicked accept, closed my laptop, and stood for a long moment in the doorway of the server room, listening to the low, steady hum of the machine, steady as breath before the plunge. The following Monday, I arrived early for Brooke's briefing. The conference room still smelled faintly of polish and burnt coffee, the kind you forget to replace because no one dares to complain. Brooke's presentation was already projected on the wall, a bright collage of logos and phrases: game-changing partnership, $8 million opportunity, fastest integration in the market. I scanned the room as people filed in, Dad beaming with that proud, almost relieved expression, investors perched with their tablets, and my engineers sitting quietly along the back wall. Ben gave me a small, uneasy nod. Paige leaned forward, pen in hand, already bracing. Brooke began with confidence. She spoke about vision, about momentum, about how this deal with Metrologics would elevate us into a new tier of industry influence. Each sentence rolled out like it had been rehearsed a dozen times in front of a mirror. I kept my focus on the numbers flashing by delivery timelines that didn't make sense, cost projections that ignored infrastructure limits, promises of real-time data migration that no current system could sustain. When she reached the final slide, applause filled the room. Dad stood to shake her hand. "Impressive work, Brooke," he said proudly. "This is the kind of bold thinking we need." I waited for him to turn to me to ask about feasibility or risk. He didn't. Instead, he told the board, "Mara will handle the technical side as usual." A polite laugh rippled across the table, the sound of a decision already made. When the room cleared, I approached Brooke. "We need to talk through those integration details," I said quietly. "What you've promised will take at least 8 months, not 6 weeks. She waved it off, still glowing from the praise. "That's why I need you. You always figure it out." I didn't argue. There was no point. You can't pull someone out of a storm until they know they're in one. That afternoon, I gathered my senior engineers in the project room. Whiteboards covered the walls, each square inch filled with diagrams and timelines. I walked them through the contract as best I could, and by the time I reached the third slide, the room had gone silent. Ben leaned back, arms crossed, his expression grim. Paige tapped her pen once against the table before speaking. "This isn't doable," she said flatly. "Not even close. We'd need triple the staff and a miracle." "We'll make our concerns known," I said. "Document everything. Emails, timestamps, conversations. No shortcuts, no silent fixes. I want a paper trail." It wasn't rebellion. It was survival. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched the company shift under Brooke's leadership. Marketing flooded social media with announcements about our upcoming transformation. HR began recruiting developers we didn't have room to train. Brooke floated through it all radiant and untouchable, too busy with interviews and investor calls to ask what was happening in the server rooms. Inside the technical department, tension grew like static before a storm. Deadlines stacked higher, morale sank lower. People who used to stay late for the love of problem-solving now left right at 5, their faces drained. I caught pieces of conversations in the hallway, frustration, disbelief, fear of being blamed. Late one night, I sat alone at my desk reviewing line after line of code. The hum of machines filled the quiet. My phone buzzed with a new message from Brooke: need a prototype for the client demo by Friday morning. Keep it simple. They just need to see progress. Simple. The word stuck like a splinter. Nothing about the promise she'd made was simple. I rubbed my temples and stared at the clock, glowing 1:42 a.m. I'd been here before under pressure, under scrutiny, but this was different. The stakes weren't just professional, they were personal, carved into the space between two sisters who had once shared everything. By Thursday, exhaustion had set in across the team. Coffee cups multiplied, tempers shortened. Ben approached my office, rubbing the back of his neck. "Please tell me we're not doing what I think we're doing," he said. "We're doing what we can," I replied. "Document everything else." Paige stepped in behind him, holding a printed copy of the requirements. She told the client we could deliver real-time integration on a legacy system built in the 80s. She said, her voice tight. "That's not just overreach, that's fantasy." I nodded. "I've already asked legal to confirm we're covered if this goes south." At that, Paige's expression softened slightly. "You think it'll go south?" "I think gravity wins every time," I said. That night, I received an email from Ethan Cole, our legal officer. "Need to discuss governance terms in your Series B agreement. In person." The next morning, he slid a folder across his desk with several yellow highlights. "I'm not telling you what to do," he said carefully, "but you should be aware of Section 7.3. It gives you veto authority on any technical contract over $5 million. I stared at the clause, the words crisp and almost invisible in their simplicity. I'd forgotten about it 5 years ago. Buried in negotiations, Naomi Parker had insisted on that safeguard. "You built the foundation," she'd said back then. "This clause protects it." By Friday morning, the inevitable happened. The demo at Metrologics was scheduled for 10 a.m. Brooke arrived early, polished, and confident, while my team fought exhaustion and a failing test environment. The system crashed at 9:42, taking half the demo data with it. Paige stared at her monitor in disbelief. Ben whispered a quiet, resigned curse. "Can we patch it?" Brooke demanded, hovering by my desk. "No," I said, steady and low. "Not safely. The system isn't ready." Her expression tightened. "You're always so negative, Mara." "I can't go in there empty-handed." "Then don't go in there pretending it's done," I replied. But she was already gone. I stayed in the control room and watched the feed from the client side on the internal channel. For the first 15 minutes, things appeared calm. Brooke greeting the Metrologics executives, a slideshow running smoothly behind her. Then the live demo began. The interface flickered once, twice, and went black. Someone on the client side swore audibly. Brooke's smile froze. The system rebooted, then crashed again. When the call came an hour later, it wasn't from Brooke. It was from Metrologics' chief technology officer. His tone was clipped, professional, unforgiving. "Your platform corrupted 3 months of our test data," he said. "We're terminating the contract immediately and reviewing legal options." I hung up and stared at the silent office around me. Within minutes, word spread. The deal was dead. $8 million gone. Dad called an emergency meeting for the next morning. I already knew what it would be. The pattern never changed: praise for Brooke when things went well, blame for me when they didn't. This time, though, I wasn't coming unprepared. That night I stayed late in the conference room, assembling every email, every warning, every documented risk we'd raised and been told to ignore. I printed copies for every board member and placed them in a neat stack. Then I added one final page, the clause from Section 7.3 highlighted in yellow. The hum of the building felt different as I turned off the lights. The silence was no longer heavy. It was waiting. I drove home through empty streets, headlights cutting narrow paths through the dark, and thought about what my father once said when the company was young: protect what you build even from yourself if you have to. I'd taken those words as devotion back then. Now they sounded like instruction. When dawn came, I stood by the window with a mug of black coffee and watched the city wake. In a few hours, I would walk into that boardroom where I'd once been invisible and listen while my father tried to make me the scapegoat for a disaster I hadn't caused. Only this time, I wouldn't be silent. By the time Saturday morning came, I'd already gone over my notes half a dozen times. The sunlight pouring through the conference room windows did little to warm the tension in the air. The board members were filtering in quiet and watchful, setting their tablets on the long, polished table. Dad stood near the head of the room jacket, buttoned voice low, as he rehearsed his talking points with Brooke. She looked pale and tired, her confidence finally cracking. When she met my eyes across the room, she tried to smile, but it faded before it reached her face. Naomi Parker took a seat halfway down the table, setting a stack of printed reports beside her. She gave me a small nod, calm and unreadable, and I wondered how much she already knew. Ethan Cole came in next, his expression neutral, his leather folder tucked neatly under one arm. "Morning," he said quietly as he passed his tone more warning than greeting. The room filled quickly. 12 board members, 5 investors, 2 legal advisors, and a single assistant taking notes. The projector flickered to life, splashing red letters across the wall. Metrologic's contract terminated, $8 million loss. You could feel the discomfort settle like dust. Brooke shuffled her papers, then began her presentation, her voice wavering at first but gaining strength as she spoke. The technical team failed to meet delivery expectations, she said, advancing to a slide filled with charts and bullet points. Despite clear timelines and allocated resources, the integration was not completed. Her tone was formal clipped, and for a moment I almost admired the steadiness she forced into it. Paige and Ben sat near the back, both silent. I could feel the heat of their frustration even from across the room. They'd worked through nights trying to keep that project afloat, knowing the collapse was inevitable. Brooke continued through her slides, missed deadlines, budget overages, technical failures, each point drawing a line straight toward me. Dad stepped forward as she finished placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "We all understand the gravity of this situation," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that once inspired trust. "As CEO, it's my duty to ensure accountability. The company can't afford uncertainty or leadership gaps during a crisis." He turned toward me, then the room holding its breath. Mara had every opportunity to review this contract and raise concerns. But concerns don't protect the company from loss. Action does. And unfortunately in this case, that action never came. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a soft murmur began at the far end of the table, confused, uncomfortable. Naomi lifted her gaze from her notes, her expression sharpening. "Charles," she said, her tone even, "are you suggesting your CTO failed to act when she knew the risks?" "I'm suggesting," he replied smoothly, "that she could have prevented this if she'd been proactive instead of reactive." Ethan shifted slightly in his seat. He wasn't looking at me. He was waiting. I opened the folder in front of me and laid out 3 printed emails, each one addressed to both Brooke and Dad, each one warning of the exact issues that had caused the failure. The timestamps were clear, the subject lines unambiguous. "I raised concerns 17 times," I said quietly. "All documented." The silence deepened. Dad's face tightened. "Concerns aren't decisions, Mara," he said, his tone soft but sharp. "If you truly believed the contract was unworkable, you should have escalated it." "I did," I said. "To you." That landed harder than I intended. Across the table, Ben shifted forward as if to speak, but I gave a small shake of my head. "Not yet." Ethan cleared his throat and stood. "Before we continue," he said, "there's additional information the board needs to consider." He opened his folder and withdrew a thick stack of documents. "Section 7.3 of our Series B agreement." Dad's color drained slightly. I knew he remembered that clause, even if he'd hoped the rest of the room didn't. Ethan read aloud, his voice steady. Any technical contract or client commitment exceeding $5 million requires the explicit written approval of the Chief Technology Officer. Without that signature, said contract is legally void. A low rustle went through the room. Naomi reached for the copy Ethan handed her and began scanning the page. "Does the Metrologics contract have Mara's signature?" she asked without looking up. "It does not," Ethan replied. "It bears signatures from the CEO and COO only." Dad straightened his jacket, his tone cooling. "That's a technicality," he said. The client believed the signatures were valid. The intent was clear. Naomi looked up from the paper, her expression steady but cold. "Intent doesn't override corporate governance, Charles. You know that." Brooke's voice cracked as she spoke for the first time since her presentation. "No one told me about this clause." "I didn't know. It's in the handbook every executive signs," Ethan said. "You acknowledged it electronically when you accepted the COO position." Her face went white. The boardroom felt smaller with every word. Naomi set the paper down. "Then let's be clear. This contract was never valid. The company cannot be sued for it. The liability sits with those who signed beyond their authority." I didn't move, didn't speak. The words didn't need help. Dad pressed his palms flat against the table. "We can resolve this internally," he said. "There's no need to make this adversarial." Naomi leaned forward slightly. "Charles, you tried to force the resignation of the only executive who followed proper procedure. The problem here isn't technical. It's leadership." For the first time, his composure faltered. I saw the realization flicker behind his eyes, the understanding that he'd lost control of the narrative he'd spent years building. Richard Hayes, one of the senior board members, cleared his throat. "This situation calls for immediate review. It's not just the contract. It's the pattern of decision-making, the nepotism, the lack of oversight." The word hung heavy in the air, nepotism. Dad's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Paige spoke quietly from the back. "We warned about the deadlines. We documented everything. Brooke told us to move forward anyway." Ben added, "She said we didn't need legal approval, that it would just slow things down." Brooke turned toward them, tears forming in her eyes. "I was trying to prove myself," she said. Naomi folded her hands. "And in doing so, you nearly cost this company everything." The room was silent again, except for the soft hum of the projector. Dad sank back into his chair, his eyes fixed on the table. I could almost see him calculating, trying to find a way to reverse what was happening, but every path was blocked by his own signatures. Naomi stood. "Given what's been presented, I propose we move to restructure the executive team immediately. The company cannot function under a system where governance is optional." Ethan nodded. "Agreed. The law is clear. The board has the authority to act." Dad started to speak, but Richard Hayes cut him off. "This isn't about you, Charles. This is about protecting a $200 million company from the consequences of poor leadership." The motion passed without hesitation. When the meeting adjourned, the room emptied quickly, everyone eager to escape the weight of what had just unfolded. Brooke stayed seated, staring at her notes, silent. Dad gathered his papers in slow, deliberate movements, then looked at me across the table. "You knew this was coming," he said quietly. "I knew the facts," I replied. For the first time, he didn't have a response. Naomi approached me as the last of the board members filed out. "That clause you negotiated 5 years ago," she said. "It saved the company." She gave me a measured look. 1 part pride, 1 part relief. "Don't waste what you just earned." I nodded, still steady, though my pulse was pounding in my ears. The hallway outside the boardroom was silent, except for the muffled sound of footsteps fading toward the elevators. When I reached my office, I sat for a long moment staring at the city skyline through the glass wall. The company I had built line by line, the family I had trusted without question, and the sister I had tried to protect, all of it had shifted in a single morning. Outside, the clouds broke just enough to let a sliver of sunlight cut through the haze. It fell across the stack of documents on my desk, the same papers that had been used to silence me, now turned into proof of truth. The meeting was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The office was quiet the morning after the board meeting, that strange kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for someone to say, "What happens next?" Outside my window, the city was still waking up, streaks of early light cutting through the skyline. On my desk sat the same folder that had changed everything: contracts, emails, signatures, and one yellow highlighted clause that had just upended the company. I thought about how easily it could have been overlooked, how a single page buried in a stack of paperwork had drawn the line between ruin and recovery. By 8, my inbox was full. Some messages were cautious congratulations, others were requests for meetings. One from Naomi stood out. "Meet me in the executive suite at 9. Bring your recommendations." I closed the laptop and took a slow breath before heading upstairs. Naomi was already there, standing near the window with her arms folded. "You handled yourself well yesterday," she said, not turning right away. "But this isn't over. The company's structure is unstable. We can't keep running it on loyalty and luck." She motioned for me to sit. "You've earned a say in what happens next. What do you propose?" I had spent half the night thinking about that question. "We need clear boundaries," I said. "Technical oversight, legal compliance, defined authority. No more verbal approvals. Everything documented, everything signed." She nodded slowly. "And your father?" "He won't like it," I admitted. "But the board will." A small smile touched her face. "Then let's give them something they can't ignore." The following week blurred into a steady rhythm of reform. Every department had to submit reports, every contract was reviewed. Ethan and I rewrote policies line by line, sometimes working until midnight. Ben and Paige rebuilt the project schedules from the ground up, stripping away impossible deadlines and empty promises. Slowly, the panic began to fade. The staff avoided mentioning Brooke. She still came to work, but her door stayed closed most of the time. I saw her once in the cafeteria standing in line for coffee. She looked smaller somehow, like the air had gone out of her. Our eyes met briefly before she turned away. I didn't chase her. There would be time for that later. Dad kept his distance, at least in public. In meetings he spoke less, listened more, but when we crossed paths in the hallway, his silence carried weight. One afternoon I found him in the old strategy room, the one lined with photos from the company's early days. He was staring at a picture of the two of us in that garage, the start of everything. "You built this," he said quietly without looking at me. "We built it," I replied. He nodded once, still studying the photo, and I almost destroyed it. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was the closest he'd ever come. 2 weeks later, Naomi called for a formal follow-up meeting. The boardroom felt different this time. The tension was still there, but it had shifted into something more productive, like a storm that had finally broken. Naomi began by outlining the need for a new structure, one that would protect the company from future governance failures. Then she turned to me. "Mara, I believe you have a proposal." I stood my palms steady against the cool surface of the table. "We need a framework that separates vision from execution," I said. "No one person should have unchecked authority, not even family." A few heads nodded. I continued. "All technical commitments must go through proper review. The COO and CTO roles will have distinct responsibilities documented and non-overlapping. Any executive who signs outside their authority will face immediate review." Richard Hayes leaned back, tapping his pen thoughtfully. "And how do you see this working with the current team?" I glanced toward Brooke, who sat at the far end of the table, shoulders tense. "We give her a chance to learn. She can shadow the technical department for 6 months, understand what we do before she leads again." Brooke's eyes widened. "You want me to start over? I want you to succeed," I said evenly. "But you can't lead what you don't understand." Naomi nodded. "Fair and forward thinking. Continue." "Finally, I said we need independent oversight. I'm recommending we bring in an external operations executive, someone with no family ties. We can't build trust if we keep repeating old patterns." The room was silent for a moment before Naomi spoke. "I move to adopt this proposal." "Seconded," Richard Hayes said almost immediately. Hands went up around the table one after another until it was unanimous. Even Dad raised his hand last. Brooke stared at the table, eyes glistening. After the meeting, she waited by the elevator. "Why didn't you let them fire me?" she asked softly. "Because that wouldn't fix anything," I said. "You still have something to offer once you understand the cost of not listening." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be there Monday, whatever you need me to do." That Monday, she showed up at 8 sharp wearing jeans and a notebook in hand. Ben gave me a questioning look, but I nodded for him to treat her like anyone else. Paige started her with the basics, how our servers worked, how our code was structured, the difference between a system bug and human error. Brooke took notes furiously, her face red more than once when she realized how little she'd known. By week's end, she was helping organize test schedules and sitting in on design reviews. She didn't talk much, but she listened, and that was a start. Meanwhile, the client fallout had reached its peak. Metrologic's legal team called to confirm they wouldn't pursue damages once Ethan provided documentation proving the contract's invalidity. Their chief technology officer, a man named David Tran, requested a follow-up meeting not to end the relationship, but to discuss a smaller pilot project. "You'll take the call," Naomi said. "They trust you." When David appeared on the screen, he smiled faintly. "We were frustrated," he said, but not surprised. "The promises didn't match the capability. Now that you're in charge, we'd like to rebuild. We discussed a realistic scope, a $2 million pilot program with proper review-achievable goals and a shared timeline." When the contract arrived a week later, it bore my signature and Ethan's, not Dad's or Brooke's. This time, everything felt right. The change inside the company was almost immediate. The tension that once filled the halls began to ease. The engineers started staying late again, not out of fear, but pride. The resignation letters stopped. Paige even brought in cupcakes one Friday afternoon, something she hadn't done in months. "You know what this feels like?" Ben said as we stood in the break room, watching the team laugh for the first time in weeks. "It feels like breathing again." I smiled. "Let's keep it that way." By the end of the month, Metrologic signed the pilot contract. The news spread quickly, and morale surged. For the first time since the disaster, the company felt alive again. Dad called me into his office late that afternoon. The blinds were open, and for once his desk wasn't cluttered with papers. He gestured for me to sit. "The board wants you to take on co-CEO responsibilities," he said quietly. "Technical strategy and operations. I'll stay on for oversight until things stabilize." I studied him for a long moment. "And you're okay with that?" He hesitated, then nodded. "It's time. You earned it." I didn't smile or celebrate. There was too much history for that. But I felt something loosen inside me, a weight finally beginning to lift. When I left his office, the sun was setting over the city, turning the glass buildings gold. The reflection caught my eye as I passed the main hallway, where we'd once hung the first framed patent. It had both our names on it, side by side. For the first time in years, that no longer felt like a reminder of what I'd lost, but a sign of what I could still build. The work ahead would be hard. The family dinners would still be strained. But for now there was balance, a fragile, necessary peace, and the quiet understanding that everything was finally shifting in the right direction. The next morning I arrived early, coffee in hand, as the team filtered in. Brooke was already at her desk reviewing system diagrams, eyes bright with concentration. Paige walked by muttering something about a syntax error, and Brooke laughed softly, a sound I hadn't heard in years. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was progress, and that I thought was enough for now. The first few weeks after the restructuring were a blur of 12-hour days and cautious optimism. The office felt different now, lighter, quieter, as if the walls themselves were exhaling. People walked with purpose again. Laughter had returned in small doses, usually from the break room, where the engineers held quick stand-ups over coffee instead of tense, whispered debates. For the first time in a long while, no one was afraid to ask questions. Brooke settled into her new role in the technical wing. Every morning she arrived early with her notebook and sat beside Paige listening while the team reviewed bugs and system reports. She didn't interrupt or try to take over. She asked questions, took notes, and learned. It was strange seeing her there among the hum of servers, her hair tied back wearing jeans instead of a tailored suit. Paige treated her like any junior staffer, direct but fair. "You'll thank me later," she'd say whenever Brooke's head started spinning from acronyms. I kept my focus on stabilizing operations. Ethan and I spent hours reviewing contracts signed during the months before the collapse. Most were salvageable. A few needed to be dissolved. I stayed late most nights drafting reports for the board and quietly preparing for the next review cycle. Naomi checked in regularly, never hovering, but always aware. "The ship's turning," she said during one call. "Don't slow down now." The Metrologix pilot began smoothly. David Tran called weekly, calm and straightforward, confirming progress without the tension that had once shadowed our meetings. "Your people know their stuff," he told me after the first milestone review. "Feels like a completely different company." I didn't disagree. Around that time, Richard Hayes invited me to lunch, a quiet steakhouse we used for investor meetings. Over a bowl of chowder, he leaned forward. "You know the board's been talking about the long term," he said. "Charles has been through a lot. They see you as the future." I nodded, careful not to react too strongly. "There's still work to do before that conversation." He smiled. "There always is." Back at the office, I found Dad waiting in my office doorway. He looked tired, like someone who had finally started seeing the cost of his own decisions. "How was lunch?" he asked. "Productive," I said simply. He stepped inside, closing the door. "The board wants you as co-CEO permanently." "So I heard. I'll stay on, of course. But they want a clear split strategy and technical under you finance and partnerships under me. That makes sense." He studied me for a moment. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." Something flickered across his expression, half pride, half regret. "You earned it, Mara, even if it took too long for me to see it. It was the closest we'd come to peace." That evening, Brooke knocked on my office door, holding a folder and looking hesitant. "Can I show you something?" She spread out a proposal across my desk, a revised client onboarding process she'd developed with Paige's input. It was smart, efficient, and grounded in reality. "Paige says it could cut delivery time by 15%, she said, almost shyly. "It could," I agreed, scanning the numbers. "Good work, both of you." Her relief was visible, a quiet exhale she didn't try to hide. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't think I'd ever get another chance." I looked up at her. "Chances aren't the problem. What you do with them is." For a moment we stood there in the soft hum of the office, two women trying to rebuild something that had been broken long before either of us realized it. The next few months moved quickly. The Metrologix pilot finished ahead of schedule, under budget, and with a glowing client review. Naomi announced the results at the quarterly meeting, praising the turnaround and the new governance model. "This is what accountability looks like," she said, glancing toward me. "The board approved another round of funding soon after Series C, at a valuation none of us could have imagined 6 months earlier. The recognition brought attention from outside investors and the media. Articles began circulating about Bennett Dynamics' comeback, most of them crediting the leadership shift. My inbox filled with invitations for interviews and conference panels, all of which I politely declined. I preferred the work itself to the noise around it. One Friday evening, as I packed up to leave, Ethan stopped by. "You're building something stronger than what you inherited," he said, dropping a signed report on my desk. "You realize that, right? I hope so," I said. He nodded. "The board's proud, Naomi too. Even your father, though, he'll never say it out loud." I smiled faintly. "He doesn't have to." The company holiday party that year felt different. No tension, no quiet gossip about who deserved what. People laughed freely. Brooke mingled comfortably with the engineers, even joining a trivia game with Ben and Paige. Dad stayed for an hour, shaking hands, smiling, but when the crowd thinned, he slipped out early. I found him later in the hallway near the exit. "Heading home?" I asked. He nodded. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice low. "You saved us." I didn't correct him. Some truths don't need to be softened. By early spring, our offices expanded into the floor above. The team was growing again, carefully, this time deliberately. Brooke had completed her technical rotation and moved into a redefined role managing partnerships under a new operations executive Naomi had recruited. She came to my office one afternoon holding a small box. Inside was a pen, the one Dad used to sign his first investor contract years ago. "He said it belongs to you now," she said. The pen was scratched and heavy, its once gold trim dulled from years of use. I turned it over in my hands, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Thank you," I said finally. She lingered by the door. "Mara," I'm sorry. For everything. I met her eyes. Then prove it. Do better. Not for me, for yourself. She nodded, a small, grateful smile on her face, before she left. The following Monday, Naomi called me into her office. We've had a strong quarter, she said. Revenue up 40%, retention at 94%. The board wants to prepare a public statement, our official comeback story. Let's make sure the message is about the team, I said. They're the reason we're still standing. Naomi studied me for a moment. You sound like someone who's finally learned what power is for. Maybe I have. That night I walked through the office long after everyone had gone home. The lights from the city spilled across the rows of desks, reflecting on the glass walls. The hum of the servers was steady, familiar, almost comforting. I thought about the nights I'd spent here alone, the years of invisible labor, the silence that once defined me. All of it had led to this balance, respect, and the quiet certainty that I no longer needed to prove my worth. When I finally left, the air outside was cool, the streetlights soft against the dark pavement. I paused on the sidewalk and looked back at the building, the company I had built and almost lost. Somewhere on the top floor, the logo glowed faintly against the glass. The road ahead would still hold challenges, competition pressure, expectations, but for the first time I felt ready for them. We weren't just rebuilding anymore. We were leading. And deep down I knew this peace, this fragile earned peace, was only the beginning of something larger, waiting just over the horizon. The first day James Morrison walked into Bennett Dynamics, the air in the building seemed to shift again, steady this time, like a weight, finding balance. He was calm, deliberate, and unbothered by the attention that came with his reputation. Naomi had personally recruited him after months of careful searching. When she introduced us, she said, "Mara, this is the kind of partner who knows how to listen." She was right. James was the kind of leader who didn't need to fill silence with noise. He had spent 25 years in tech, from coding in his 20s to running operations for some of the biggest companies in the industry. He greeted the team without pretense, taking time to learn everyone's names, even those who rarely stepped out of the server room. By noon, I saw Paige actually smile as he asked her about the platform she'd been refining for months. That afternoon, we met privately to discuss how we'd divide responsibilities. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded loosely. "I'll handle sales partnerships and investor relations," he said. "You stay where your strength is, product engineering innovation. I'll sell the dream, you'll make it real." It was exactly what the company needed, a balance of vision and execution. Over the next few months, we fell into a rhythm that made sense. Every Monday morning, we met with department heads. James approached problems with patience, always asking questions before offering answers. I found that we rarely disagreed, and when we did, we resolved it before leaving the room. The board noticed. Naomi said during one quarterly call, "This is the first time in years we're operating like a company built on strategy, not survival." Brooke was thriving in her new position under James's supervision. Her background in communication and client relations proved valuable when she wasn't trying to lead what she didn't understand. She scheduled meetings with potential partners, organized workshops, and developed case studies showing how our systems helped clients save money. Her updates were clear, professional, and grounded in facts, not promises. One afternoon, she stopped by my office, tapping gently on the door. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "Of course," I said, setting aside a report. She took a seat, a nervous smile tugging at her lips. "David Tran called me this morning. Metrologics wants to expand the pilot. They're ready for a full-scale implementation." I studied her expression, waiting for the catch. "There wasn't one. They requested you on the project again," she added. "But David said he'd like me to oversee the client side this time, communication, not technical." I told him I'd be honored. "That's good news," I said. "You've earned it." Her eyes brightened, and for a moment, the distance between us felt smaller. By spring, revenue had climbed 40%. Employee retention reached levels we hadn't seen in years. Glassdoor reviews spoke of trust, leadership, and finally being heard. It wasn't dramatic, it was steady, a quiet transformation that felt real. Then came the board's decision to raise another funding round, Series C. Naomi led the announcement herself during a company-wide meeting. $50 million, she said, pausing just long enough for the applause to fade. We're being valued at $300 million, and that's not because of luck. It's because of the systems this team rebuilt from the ground up. The applause this time wasn't forced. It came from every corner of the room, the engineers, the developers, even the interns. I glanced at James, who smiled slightly. He leaned over and whispered, "You realize you're the reason people are clapping, right?" I shook my head. "No. The reason they're clapping is because they feel safe here again." After the meeting, Dad stopped me in the hallway. His expression was unreadable. "I didn't think it would turn out this way," he said quietly. "Neither did I. I'm proud of you, Mara," he said, "and of Brooke." That night, he sent an email to the entire company announcing his plan to step down as co-CEO within 2 years and transition into a board-only role. The subject line read, "The future has arrived." The message was short, almost humble, and it marked the end of an era. The following months moved quickly. James and I finalized a 5-year roadmap, one built on sustainable growth and employee well-being. The culture was changing from the inside out. Brooke's division brought in 2 new major clients, and she handled both flawlessly. Paige and Ben began mentoring younger engineers, building a training program to retain new hires. Even Dad started showing up less often content to let the new structure run itself. But not everything was seamless. Success brings its own kind of noise. With new recognition came new pressures, investors pushing for faster expansion partners, hinting at acquisitions, recruiters trying to poach key people. The more attention we received, the more careful we had to be. One evening after a long strategy session, James stopped by my office. "Naomi thinks we should consider a media feature," he said, "a story about the company's turnaround." I looked up from my notes. "You mean a profile?" He nodded. Forbes reached out. "They want to feature us in their summer issue, The Quiet Comeback of Bennett Dynamics." The title made me smile. Fitting. "You should be on the cover," he said. I shook my head. Let the company speak for itself. He gave me that look, the kind that said he already knew my answer. "You can't keep hiding behind the work forever," he said gently. "You built this." When the article was published, it painted a picture that felt both accurate and foreign. It spoke of governance reform, leadership renewal, and family redemption. It credited the success to both James's strategy and my technical leadership. But what caught me off guard was the closing paragraph. Naomi had given a quote I hadn't seen before. "Sometimes power doesn't change people. It reveals who they were all along." The story went viral overnight. Messages poured in from other women in tech, from engineers and founders who had faced the same struggles dismissed, underestimated, or overshadowed. Some wrote to thank me. Others simply said they felt seen. Brooke sent a message, too. "They finally know what I've known all along. You built this place." Dad didn't say much about the feature, but during the next board meeting, he listened more than he spoke. When it adjourned, he waited for the room to clear, then said quietly, "The article was right about one thing. It's time I learn how to let go." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You should know the board's preparing to make your role permanent sole CEO after I step down. They'll announce it next quarter." I didn't speak for a moment. The words felt heavier than I expected. "And you're okay with that?" He met my eyes. "I am now." The drive home that evening was quiet, the city lights reflecting off the windshield. I thought about all the late nights, the missed birthdays, the arguments that left scars no one could see. I thought about Brooke finally standing on her own 2 feet and the team that had weathered the storm with me. It wasn't about titles anymore. It was about peace, earned, not gifted. When I got home, the first thing I did was place the old gold-trimmed pen Dad had given me on my desk. The scratch across its barrel caught the light, reminding me of how far we'd come. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next crisis. The next chapter was already waiting, quiet, steady, and mine to write. When the official announcement came through that I'd be stepping in as sole CEO, it didn't arrive with fireworks or speeches, just a simple line in the company memo. Effective immediately, Mara Bennett will assume full executive leadership of Bennett Dynamics. I sat alone in my office as the message went out, the quiet hum of the city filling the space between breaths. Years of long nights, doubt, and invisible labor had finally distilled into one clear moment. Outside my door, I could hear a ripple of applause travel down the hallway. Someone shouted congratulations, and then another voice joined until it became a steady rhythm echoing through the glass walls. When I stepped out, the team was gathered in the open workspace. Paige smiled, eyes bright. "It's about time," she said. Ben raised a mug from his desk. "To the captain who actually reads the map." Laughter rolled through the room, warm and genuine. James was standing by the elevator, hands in his pockets. "You know, he said most people would have called it quits halfway through what you've endured." I smiled. I wasn't raised to quit. He nodded, that steady look in his eyes that made people trust him instantly. "Good, because the next phase will test everything you've built." He was right. The transition from shared leadership to single command brought both clarity and pressure. The investors trusted me completely, but with that came expectation. Every metric, every partnership, every public statement carried weight now. Still, it felt right. The company wasn't fragile anymore. It was solid, earned, not inherited. Dad came by that afternoon. He looked smaller somehow in the doorway, no longer the man who filled every room with his certainty. "I wanted to say congratulations in person," he said quietly. "Thank you," I replied. He hesitated, then handed me a small square envelope. "Something to hang in your office. From the early days." Inside was a photo me at 24 standing beside him in the garage, both of us smiling over a whiteboard full of hand-drawn system diagrams. "You kept the company alive when no one else could," he said. "I see that now." It wasn't forgiveness or apology. It was acknowledgement, and that was enough. The following weeks moved quickly. News outlets picked up the transition story, most of them framing it as a full-circle moment, a founder passing the torch to his daughter after a historic turnaround. The company's image, once bruised, had become an example of resilience and reform. Applications poured in from people who wanted to be part of something built on integrity. Brooke surprised me one morning by walking into my office with 2 cups of coffee. "I booked something for us," she said. I looked up. "Booked a joint interview," she said, smiling nervously. "They want the Bennett sisters segment for a Women in Leadership feature." I hesitated, and she caught it immediately. "You don't have to say yes," she added quickly. But I thought maybe it could show people what rebuilding looks like. I studied her face, the calm sincerity there, so different from the restless ambition I once resented. "All right," I said, "let's do it." The interview took place a week later in one of our newly renovated conference rooms. The reporter asked about leadership, family, and forgiveness. Brooke spoke honestly about her mistakes and what she'd learned shadowing the technical team. I didn't understand the work, she said. I only understood results. Now I see that leadership isn't about control, it's about service. When it was my turn, I said simply, "Growth requires humility from all of us." Afterward, the reporter asked for one last photo, the 2 of us standing side by side, the skyline glowing through the glass behind us. The image ran the next month under the headline, "From Conflict to Collaboration, How the Bennett Sisters Rebuilt a Legacy." The reaction was overwhelming. Messages from women in leadership flooded our inboxes, stories of family businesses, healed careers, restarted lessons relearned. Naomi sent a brief note that said only, "You've done more than restore a company, you've restored trust." A few days later, the board convened to celebrate the company's new milestones. Series C funds were fully closed, and our client roster had doubled. Richard Hayes stood to give a toast. "We've witnessed something rare," he said. "Not just recovery, but transformation." Glasses clinked. Brooke caught my eye across the table and smiled. When the meeting ended, James lingered behind. "You'll be getting calls," he said. "Partnership offers, acquisition inquiries. Everyone wants a piece of a good story." "Let them call," I said. "We'll decide what's worth answering." In the months that followed, the company's growth accelerated, but this time it was measured sustainable. We hired new managers, expanded into 2 more cities, and began development on a mentoring program for women in tech. Brooke proposed naming it the Eleanor Initiative, after our grandmother who'd once said, "If you learn something the hard way, make it easier for the next person." On launch day, the entire team gathered in the atrium. The new plaque gleamed beneath the lights, the Eleanor Initiative, empowering the next generation of builders. Brooke stood beside me, reading it silently. "She'd like this," she whispered. "She would," I agreed. Dad attended quietly in the back, hands clasped. When the applause ended, he walked up to me. "Your grandmother would have said you did more than fix things," he said. "You changed what this family stands for." I didn't know what to say. The silence between us, once so sharp, now felt peaceful. A week later, James and I met Naomi at a quiet rooftop restaurant to discuss future plans. The evening air was warm and the city stretched out below like a network of light. Naomi lifted her glass. "To endurance," she said, "and to knowing when to stop surviving and start living." We laughed softly. She looked at me. "So Mara, what's next?" I thought for a moment. "Expansion, mentorship, maybe some time off," I said. "It's been a long road." Naomi smiled. "Then take it. The company will keep running. It's built to." That night, as I walked back to my car, I paused to look up at the skyline again. The same lights that once symbolized sleepless ambition now looked different, steady, not urgent. Each window belonged to someone finishing a day's work, heading home to something more than success. The next morning, when I arrived at the office, there was a small envelope on my desk. Inside was a note from Brooke. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for showing me how to build instead of chase." Below it was a photograph, the two of us from the interview standing side by side with the city behind us. I framed it and placed it beside the old garage photo Dad had given me. 2 pictures years apart, one of beginnings built from nothing, one of beginnings rebuilt from everything. Outside my office, I could hear the quiet rhythm of work keyboards, clicking phones, ringing voices steady. It sounded like progress, and it felt like peace. I looked out at the skyline, the morning light rising over the buildings, and realized the story wasn't ending at all. It was finally settling into balance, right where it was always meant to be. 2 years have passed since that quiet morning when I looked out over the city and felt for the first time like I had finally arrived where I belonged. The world looks different now, not louder or brighter, just clearer. Our company has doubled again in size, but what I value most isn't the numbers. It's the calm, the sense that everyone from the interns to the board knows they are part of something built on truth instead of ego. Brooke sits across from me in the conference room most mornings, her focus sharp but steady. She's no longer the uncertain deputy who once measured her worth by comparison. Now she's our chief revenue officer, confident and composed, her questions precise and purposeful. Sometimes I catch flashes of the sister I used to wish for when we were younger, the one who listened, who understood without competition. And now she's here. Dad's name still hangs on the founder's wall downstairs. He visits occasionally for board meetings, quieter than he used to be, but more present in ways that matter. At the last one, he handed me a thin folder, a personal letter he'd written, before stepping down completely. "I thought about giving this to you years ago," he said, "but I wasn't ready." The letter was short, handwritten, and honest. He wrote about his fear of being replaced, about how pride can blind even the best intentions. He ended it with one line, "You didn't take my legacy, Mara. You gave it back its purpose." I read it 3 times before closing the folder. Some forgiveness doesn't come through words, it comes through understanding. Naomi still calls every few weeks. She says the company is her favorite investment story, but we both know it's not about returns. She tells me she's mentoring 2 new founders, now young women navigating the same struggles I once faced. "You made them believe it's possible," she said during our last call. That quiet strength doesn't mean weakness. I think about that often. Strength isn't what people see when you win a boardroom fight. It's the restraint to choose what builds instead of what breaks. I learned that the hard way. The Eleanor Initiative has grown faster than we imagined. It now funds scholarships for women entering data science programs, hosts mentoring sessions, and offers internships through partnerships with other firms. Brooke oversees the outreach. Every year we invite the first group of recipients back to share what they've learned. Their stories remind me why I stayed through all the chaos. They remind me that legacy isn't about who gets the credit, it's about who carries the lessons forward. Last month, Metrologics renewed their contract for another 5 years. David Tran sent a short note along with the paperwork. "We trust Bennett Dynamics because your team never promises what it can't deliver." That, to me, was the real victory. One Friday evening after the office had emptied and the sun dipped low behind the skyline, I stood in the lobby looking at the wall of portraits, founders, leaders, teams from every era. Mine was there now beside Dad's. 2 frames side by side, the past and the present sharing quiet space. For a long time I thought that moment would feel like triumph. Instead it felt like peace. When I finally turned to leave, I noticed Brooke had left something on the front desk, a small brass plaque wrapped in ribbon. I unwrapped it and read the engraving, "Built on Integrity, Led with Grace." I smiled, knowing she had borrowed those words from something I'd said long ago. Outside, the night air carried the sound of the city steady, alive, and familiar. I thought about everything that had brought me here, the long hours in that first garage, the boardroom confrontation that changed everything, the years of being underestimated, and the lessons that taught me what real leadership looks like. It isn't about control. It's about responsibility. About seeing the people behind the systems, the families behind the paychecks, and the trust behind every signature. Power isn't about having the last word. It's about knowing which words matter. Sometimes I still get letters from women who've heard our story online. They tell me they're standing where I once stood, unseen, undercut, dismissed, and they ask what changed everything. I always tell them the same thing. Document your worth, protect your value, and never mistake humility for silence. Because quiet people aren't weak. We're deliberate. We're the ones building foundations while others chase attention. And when the time comes to stand our ground, we already know exactly who we are. That's what this journey taught me. The storm will come, family, betrayal, business, whatever form it takes, but the foundation you've built through patience and integrity will hold if you've done the work. And when the clouds clear, you'll realize the peace that follows isn't luck. It's justice, finally finding its way home. I locked the office door behind me, the echo of my footsteps following softly across the marble floor. Outside, the city lights flickered like quiet applause. I paused for a moment, then smiled to myself. If this story found its way to you, maybe it's because you needed to be reminded that dignity and kindness can coexist with strength, that standing your ground doesn't mean closing your heart. So if you've ever had to fight to be seen or to rebuild what others tried to take, remember this: you don't have to shout to be powerful. You just have to keep building. Thank you for listening. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who's finding their voice again. Sometimes that's all the encouragement they need to start writing their own ending.